Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Building Bigger Lives podcast. I'm Michael Regan, along with my co-host, Kathryn Peterson. And as always, we look forward to bringing topics that we hope are helping you enrich your life personally and professionally. And we look for creative ways, whether we're bringing in a book, a guest, or a topic that we feel is really timely. And this one is no exception. We're, depending on when you're catching this particular episode, we are entering into the fall season, which means before long, the holidays will be approaching. And what tends to happen around this time of year is everyone is working so hard to finish the year strong. Everyone is working so hard to create whatever personal plans they have for the holidays. And what often gets missed is the annual planning process. So we decided, let's get ahead of that. Let's get some, cozy winter gear on and get ourselves ready for a planning process episode in which we lay out what New Year's planning can look like, some best practices, and some direction we'd like to give you on how to be successful in the new year, because most of us do this process at some point, and we want to make sure it's not a set it and forget it. So without any further setup, I'd like to bring into the frame my favorite co-host, Kathryn Peterson. Always great to see you.
Good to see you, Michael. Thanks for being here. And I think that one of the things that can set up our year well is planning for it. So I'm glad to be bringing this up ahead of time. As usual, we're typically on the ball with the timing, but it's a great time of the year to talk about it and to get things going. So with that, I've got a bunch of questions for you.
Oh, I'm sure you do. And before we dive into the first question, I'll just say that I think this is one of those opportunities that most of us have available to us, regardless of what you've done in the past. So if you're listening today, don't look at this as a pass fail. Look at this as an opportunity, because anyone, regardless of what you've done in the past, can glean from this episode some things they can put into practice right now that'll help lower your stress and accelerate your process into the new year. So fire when ready, my friend.
All right. So tell me a little bit about what's different in a annual planning process or a New Year's planning process than would be in a quarterly planning process or even a monthly, planning activity. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I would say that the bulk of any annual planning we're going to do, and by the way, let's draw the distinction between New Year's planning and annual planning, because for some of us, we operate on a system that is perhaps not tied to the calendar year. And so if that's the case, the term annual planning allows you to do this at any point in which your organization experiences a fiscal year, or at any point, let's say you're in education, you might be working off of a school year. So there are different versions of this that would apply. So annual planning is a nice generic term, but most of us tend to operate on somewhat of an annual calendar. And so if that's you and we're approaching this, I'd say the biggest difference between this and what you might do quarterly or monthly is really rooted in strategy. That would be the word I would use for the annual planning process. Is this is really the time to evaluate your strategy before you dive into your tactics and your execution. And we'll dive into the details of what each of those terms mean, but strategy is really what the annual planning process is all about. It's making sure that your alignment of the goals that you have and the resources that you have get synchronized with the amount of fuel you're going to be able to put behind them. That could be money, that could be energy, that could be time. And so you got to figure out a way to get all those things in alignment before you just start going. If you don't choose to do that, the risk is you could be burning valuable resources too early in the year and not have enough fuel when you need it most. Or if this is just energy, it could be, you get burnt out. The emotion of the year peaks too early, and you're not prepared for the dog days of summer or the long fall season or the cold winter ahead. So I like to view this as a strategy session where we're going to look at this from beginning to end. And the old phrase of begin with the end in mind is a great way to approach the annual planning process.
So just to put some example to it, I was thinking of a woman who just finished the Appalachian Trail in 40 days, which is crazy, right? So I think of the strategy being, do have the best possible time at the, finishing the Appalachian Trail versus that quarterly planning might be, hey, I'm going to need this team behind me. Hey, I'm going to need to do some check-ins along the way because I've got this stop here and that stop here, and I'm going to have to resupply at this place and this place. So when you were talking through that, I was thinking of her and her planning for this is that kind of overall goal, but then all the little ones in between.
Yeah, I think you've got it. I think that's exactly it. We can have a big goal, something that's wildly important to us that we plan to achieve, but at some point we have to strategize on exactly what we're going to do to accomplish that goal. And some of that involves the preparation, whether it's the things we need or the stage gates we need to pass. And so I think you really do understand that clearly. I hope our audience does too. And for those of us that have never experienced annual planning before, hopefully that gives you a little bit of curiosity or interest in leaning into the rest of this topic, because if you haven't experienced that before, it's likely that you jumped right into the execution of, well, I know what my goals are, so just get to work. And that can be daunting for some folks when they realize maybe they weren't, like that gal on the Appalachian Trail, weren't prepared for the number of nights they were going to sleep out in the cold, or when they were going to sleep, or how they were going to refuel, or whatever other details she needed. So I'm glad you brought that illustration into the conversation.
Yeah, of course, I heard that and thought, oh my gosh, all the planning involved. Okay, so then let's talk through what are the parts of an annual plan?
So I'll break them up into three categories just to keep it simple. I think there's a reflect, I think there's a connect, and then I think there's a plan. So here are what those three pieces look like. The reflect is, at some point, I want any of you that are approaching annual planning to make sure you do a good and healthy review of the year you've just had, because it's the most recent example of where your current momentum came from. Where are we today is best reviewed through the context of, well, how did we get here? What were some of the factors? Now, we may not carry all of that learning into the new year. There may have been some negative events. There may have been some positive events that aren't necessarily going to repeat themselves, but it's healthy for more than just looking at the numbers or looking at some of the transactional details. It's also healthy to see, what did that do to impact your attitude and your mindset before you approach the planning process, because there could be lots of things that happen that were learning experiences over the last year. And I want to capture all of those before I just jump ahead and hit, auto refresh replay. So reflect is the first thing, and you've done this with me before, Kathryn. We have a great
Mhm.
tool at Building Champions for a role reflection that I love, because it pulls in both personal and professional questions designed to get you to journal all of the details that we can think of that help you complete that exercise. And once you've properly reflected, I think we have to then transition to the connect piece. That's where we're going to connect some of those reflections with those data points that you have. So doing a deep dive on your numbers, whether it was the tracking details that you did, whether it's the accounting that you have, maybe you're managing a P&L, maybe you're a sole proprietor and you're just managing your bank accounts in QuickBooks. Wherever you're managing the numbers, we want to reconcile those accounts with those reflections that you just completed, so that you now have the two things you need in order to plan. You have a little bit of the head and the heart. You know exactly what those numbers were, and you know the storylines that went with them. So I like to say, when the words and the pictures match up, we can move forward. The plan is the third step, and I'm sure we'll spend the rest of the episode digging into this one. But those are the three frames that I would encourage anyone to consider: reflect, connect, and then plan.
Great. I love breaking it down into parts because it's always a little less daunting when you have it that way.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a good way to describe it. So then with that, anything else someone needs to know to kind of sit down and prep for that? How long will that take? How long should they plan for that to take? What other tools do they need?
Yeah. So, great questions, and let's break them into, just two simple parts. I think one is creating the space you need, and the other is bringing all the resources you'll need to make that time successful. I'm a big believer that an annual plan is something that is best done as an all-day focus. It doesn't mean you'll need the whole day to do it. It means if you have all day to focus on it, some of that time can be spent in the planning process, and some of that time can be spent um, letting that seep, just like a great pot of coffee that you're making in a French press. It needs to seep a little before you drink it. We want to let some of the stuff seep into your mind. And so creating the space to do that where you're not hustling in and out of phone calls or hustling in and out of emails or hustling in and out of appointments. If I can get you to take one day, that's really, I call this an on day where you're going to work on the business rather than an in day where you're working in the business. If I can get you to dedicate a day to that process, that's usually the space you need. As far as the tools or resources that you might need, I mean, these tend to be abundant. A lot of your organizations, those of you listening, have resources. So there's usually not a shortage of resources to access. There's usually a shortage of the first, which is dedicating the time to do it. But if you're concerned that you may not have the adequate resources, there are some resources available, and I'm happy to put those in our show notes that Building Champions provides for its clients. And I'm happy to share those with the listeners of our podcast if they would like to download a copy. So I'll make sure that those are available in our show notes. But I do have a reflection tool, as I mentioned earlier. I do have a planning tool, and I do even have a tool that's designed to chunk down the numbers so that you can take the review of those calculations and now project them forward so that your numbers become a guide to the amount of activity that needs to repeat or increase those numbers in the year ahead. Um, but yeah, I think if I were splitting your question into two, I'd put more effort into blocking out the time and really making it uninterrupted time. So do everything you can to make it a do not disturb day if at all possible.
Yeah, that's great advice. And those have been the most impactful where I lock myself in a hotel room or leave the office. I think that's an important thing because if you're here, people can find you. And so I think being somewhere else is key as well. And I think you can always think better if you have some nature, but that can be hard also for planning.
Yeah.
But I think that as long as you're not getting interrupted, that's the important part of that. So then tell me how the annual plan then translates into the quarterly plan. So how is that rolled forward?
So my advice for most of us is that part of that plan that you're conducting for your annual is to schedule out your quarterly business reviews. So for clients that I've worked with, they will often be able to open their Outlook and find a QBR in their calendar already scheduled at the beginning of the year because it's easy for us to look at our annual calendar before it gets filled up with minutia and identify days in which we're prepared for a quarterly business review long before that quarter ends. So, this is not a difficult exercise. If your quarters are financial, then at March 31st, you're wrapping up the financial quarter. And depending upon how soon your organization reports that data, might be a week later, might be a few weeks later, sometime in April, you'll be able to schedule your first QBR and do that throughout the year. If you're not following financial quarters, then you may do that based on seasons. You may say, well, the spring season ends on March 22nd. So maybe by the first week of April, you're ready for a QBR. Whichever cycle your business follows, getting them scheduled is key. Once they're scheduled, I think then you want to bring into that meeting. And by the way, this is going to be a shorter meeting. You don't need all day to do a QBR. QBR could depending on the complexity of your business. So I want to be careful. Some of our audience may be running really large organizations and teams, and some of you may be, sole proprietors. But you won't need all day to do this. So maybe it's a half day if you're a large organization. Maybe it's an hour to 90 minutes if you're a sole proprietor. But schedule some time for that QBR in which you're going to do a micro version of that annual process where you're now reviewing those quarterly numbers against your quarterly plan. And I think we probably need to talk about that as well, Kathryn, because when we do an annual plan, I'm a big believer of chunking that plan down into quarters. You and I've done I don't know how many of these over the years. At Building Champions, we call these focus plans. But a focus plan is really designed to take that annual plan and break it down into a 90-day segment of time to say, okay, if that was our annual goal and those are the annual strategies that we've agreed to, what will we do in the first 90 days to get this plan off the ground with the momentum we need? Well, the review of that document along with those financials at the end of the quarter is the best way to now recast your second quarterly plan and then repeat that QBR at the end of the second quarter, repeat it again at the end of the third quarter. Because if you don't have those stage gates already scheduled and set, the risk is you launch into the new year with a lot of emotional momentum, but as the year gets going, you might get disoriented or distracted, and suddenly you're well into the year, maybe halfway before you realize I haven't even really reconciled what I said I would do against my numbers to see does anything even require adjustment. So again, I would say this one is probably best summed up by saying have that time blocked out early and dedicate that time to the review of just those two things. What did I say I would do in that quarterly focus plan? And what do the numbers tell me are reflecting up to that date related to those activities? And what adjustments do I need to make?
And we have a whole episode on the simple business plan, the simple focus business plan, I should say. And so check that one out as well, because I think that'll help you when you go through this process.
You're not wrong to say simple business plan. We just did a little rebranding on that during the COVID season. We found that our classic tool, the simple business plan, really needed a little more of a framework of those same commitments we were making personally. Because during COVID season, most of us were working from home. Most of us
Mhm.
had to figure out how to harmonize our work execution with our personal lives. And so for the first time, we really needed to see all of that on one dashboard. So we decided to create an updated version of that. And that's where the term focus plan came into play because you can't call the same tool the same thing and change it. You got to give it a new name.
Right. Absolutely. No, I love it. I love it. So then one of the things that I've seen on the annual plan is a annual theme. So what are some suggestions on coming up with that theme and then how does that drive the business for the next year?
It's so funny you asked this, Catherine, because I find this is early, right? When you and
Yeah.
I've done the annual planning process, it's early in the process. Is we'll ask a question around the theme for the year, and we tell you, hey, this could be a 1 to 5 words or a short phrase that captures what this year is going to be all about. And it's amazing how this divides the audience. Like you'll get a group of people who
Mhm.
just off the top of their head, they riff something profound, they write it down, and they're off to the races. And then you get another group that sits there just stonewall. They're just, I don't know what it that it, and what we find out is, this is exercising your creative brain, and some of us are more naturally creative, and some of us are a little less naturally creative. And all I would encourage the audience is if you don't find yourself to be naturally creative, don't get hung up on this step. Don't let it be a hurdle you have to clear.
Mhm.
Get something down that captures the words that are flowing from your mind, knowing that you have permission to come back later and edit it if the process you work through suddenly clarifies that theme. Because you may find out a couple hours later, oh, wait a minute, this is what it's really all about.
Mhm.
And you're the master of that plan. So go back and edit that out and change it. So don't get hung up on it, would be my advice. If you are naturally creative and it just flows and you go, that's great. You may too, as a creative person, change it 10 times because that's what creative people like to do is, take their painting and keep adding another flair here and there. I would say it's a incredibly important part of the process because what it does is it creates a focal point for everything else you're going to write. If the year is going to be about the words you captured in your theme, then that's a filter you can now use to all the questions you're going to answer. So if a question comes up and your first answer feels very practical, and then you go back to your theme and you're like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with that. My advice as your coach is, well, then maybe that's not the answer for that particular question. How would you answer it in light of your theme? And
Mhm.
suddenly that answer can change because you're realizing, oh, well, if the year's going to be about this, well, then that question would lead me to say this. Great. Then let's say that and let's keep working toward that theme because themes are a rally cry. They keep you and your team focused on the direction we're going to go and hopefully the outcomes we're going to experience.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes I'll do mine in the middle because I'm not quite sure where I want to go. And then if I start to kind of think through some of the, pieces and parts of the plan, I go,
It
oh
starts
yeah,
to show up.
this is all a little bit about this. And then it helps me solidify the last few items.
I hope our audience just heard that, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, it starts to show up. I really am glad you said that
Mhm.
because That's great. That's another way to exercise the authority you have over this process is I'll write it down when I'm ready, when it
Yeah.
comes to me. A-okay. Maybe the best way to leave this topic is try not to miss the theme opportunity, because if you miss it, you miss the opportunity to create that filter that brings so much more cohesion and focus to the plan you've created. So it is a really important step. If you've got it up front, great. If it comes to you in the middle, that's okay, but don't leave without it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's good. All right. Any other tips, tricks on finishing this up and any next steps in the process?
Well, if you've created the time to do it and you have the resources to do it, some of us will feel like this is a bit of a task. Like, I've just got to get this off my plate. And if that's the mindset you take into it, it's not that you won't complete it, but it may end up producing an experience that feels like a task. And therefore, the completion causes you to think, okay, great. Save, file, goodbye. And my hope for you, if that's the way you approach it, is that you'd consider the benefit of saving it, maybe creating a file for it, but then placing a copy of it on your desktop or printing a copy of it and keeping it in your portfolio, somewhere where you can see it on a regular basis as a reminder. We talked about quarterly business reviews, but let's insert this piece. Your annual plan, if that is your strategic plan, is going to lead you to this focus plan, which is where you're going to create the tactical execution to make that plan happen. I would guess if you scheduled time on a weekly basis to simply read through those documents, it might take you 10 minutes, 15 minutes to read through your strategy for the year and a quick review of what you committed to this quarter tactically.
Mhm.
But how much better would your attention to the detail be if you spent that 15 minutes a week simply reviewing the words you wrote? My guess is one of two things would happen along the way. One is it would be highly encouraging to keep you on track. Like, you would not feel as disoriented or distracted. But this is the other option. Maybe the year evolves a bit. You wrote this plan, maybe late in the fourth quarter for the year ahead, but let's pretend we could time travel back to 2019. You and I did a really great 2020 business plan. In fact, part of that plan involved you doing some site visits to different offices around the country. One was out in
Correct.
San Diego, one was in Phoenix. I don't know, there were some other places. And somewhere during your journeys in that first quarter, we landed at an event in Scottsdale with some other top producers and found out that maybe the world was experiencing something that we'd never heard of before called COVID-19. And without making light of this, because this was a very real event for people, it was very disorienting to the plans we had created. And I think
Mhm.
most of us remember how we felt in that room. I remember we all stood there going, what happens next? And do you remember the first maybe 3 or 4 weeks, what we thought was going to happen? Like, do you remember how that felt? We thought the world was going to end. Like,
Yeah.
forget your plan. Like, now we're in survival mode. And it turned out about 30 days later that, wait a minute, shelter at home means home suddenly becomes more valuable than it's ever been. And suddenly everybody wanted to get their housing situation figured out. And then rates started falling
Yeah.
as the Fed began to intervene. I don't need to recount that story other than to say that plan we created wasn't a bad plan.
Mhm.
It just didn't know we were going to experience that. So if you're in that category of, hey, I don't know if I love this because things can change, let me ask you a simple question. Would you rather deal with events as they come, knowing that you have a plan that you can modify? Or would you rather just spend your life reacting and winging it, hoping to always, outfox the events that are in front of you? Somebody out there's nodding and saying, "Yeah, I like that. That's me." Great. I'm not here to convince you otherwise. I think for most of us, your anxiety goes down a little when you're modifying an existing plan rather than just winging it every day. And so, if an event like that happens, I think we've been through that experience recently. We'll
Yep.
shift and we'll reset.
Absolutely. Yeah, as we've all said, the plans are in pencil, not in pen, and yes, we may print them, and yes, they might be there, but you can always adjust them. And we definitely did during that time frame. And I remember us doing very short time frame plans of, okay, do I need to hire? What do I need to do? And it changed the planning process, but it was still a plan.
Yeah, I definitely I'm not happy that event happened because I know how much pain it caused for certain people, and I'll never celebrate people's pain. But given that we didn't have control over what was happening, I was really impressed with how most of us found a way to pivot and do just what you said, is to, hold that plan loosely, make the course corrections that were needed, and then put our focus on to helping as many people as we could. And that turned out to be a really great season for us in the
Mhm.
housing industry. Maybe not great for everyone, but we figured out how to way to make the best of it. And that's going to be my hope for the years ahead is your annual plan will serve as a guide. It's like a compass. It's telling you where the direction we're heading. Um, but you may get weather and it may throw you off your course and you may have to make some course corrections as you go. I'd rather be working with a plan that has course corrections than sailing out into the blue ocean, just hoping to find the other side
Mhm.
of the world.
Totally. Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place for us to end today. And today we talked about the annual planning process, all the pieces and parts, what to know, what to be prepared with, how to get through that, and how to move that forward into your quarterly plan and into your even weekly activities. Michael, anything to add before we close it out?
No, I'll just go back to where we started. Make sure you dedicate the time to do this. That's really the key ingredient. Most of us are pros. If we dedicate the time, we'll use that time well. If you've got a need for resources, look for those in the links to our show notes, but make the time because you won't regret it. You can always use that time differently should you not need as much of it as you dedicated, but it's really hard to squeeze it in later if you didn't block it out early.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Michael, for that. This ends another Building Bigger Lives podcast with Michael Regan and Kathryn Peterson. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts, and on Instagram. Reach out to us at any of those spots. And thank you so much for listening and being a part of Building Bigger Lives.